The only reason that we've kind of neglected these things is probably because we've never been able to see these forms of life. Babies who are born by C-section versus those who are born by a standard delivery have different microbiomes. These antibiotics destroy your good microbes as well.
We have a sponsor for this episode of Apple Finch Pudding. Now, before I delve into this, I want to be very clear about what we use the sponsorship for. We use it to support the podcast. This means buying subscriptions to the software we need to create these episodes or put our episodes online. This might also include some editing or some other material or software we need to create this podcast. That being said, our sponsor for this episode is SciSummary. As scientists, we need to read a lot of papers, and more papers are being published every day. As a result, reading papers is becoming more or less a full-time job for scientists, leaving us virtually with no time to do our actual jobs, which is research. This is where SciSummary comes in. SciSummary provides you with an AI-based summary of the papers you provide. But SciSummary is much more than just a summarizing tool. It lets you effectively chat with your papers. You can ask questions like what methods are being used, and it even provides you with some insights and opportunities for future research based on the papers you provide. If you want to try out SciSummary for yourself, there is a link in the description below, which will also give you a 7-day free trial. Now, let's go back to the show. Welcome to Apple Finch Pudding, your gateway into the world of science. Today's scientist is Ruairi Robertson, a lecturer in Microbiome Sciences at Blizard Institute, Queen Mary University of London, and host of the Biomes podcast. Welcome, Ruairi.
Thanks very much, Jeroen. I'm delighted to be here.
My first question is always the same. Do you have a fun science fact for our listeners?
Oh, I probably do. As you'll find out, study all the microbes and all the bugs inside of us. So my favorite fact related to my research, I suppose, is that by cell count, we are as much microbial as we are human, as in the number of cells in our body, as many of them are bacterial as they are mammalian cells. And we're probably outnumbered by viruses and other cells. And genetically, we're even less human. We're only about 1% human in terms of the number of genes that we contain. And we're 99, probably 0.9% microbial. So we're less human than we think.
That's insane. So, okay. So what you said, cell count. So do you also have an idea about maybe volumes or stuff?
Yeah, so bacterial cells generally are much smaller than human cells. So it's kind of hard to quantify these things. People have tried to do it. They've tried to kind of take the average male and, count up the number of mammalian cells and number of bacterial cells. And so kind of the rough estimate at the moment is there's maybe about 200 grams worth of bacterial mass inside of us. But I mean, that depends on a huge number of factors, how much you've eaten and your size and all these different things, and whether you have an infection probably. But yeah, about that, a good few hundred grams probably.
200 grams doesn't sound that much, but when you look at the numbers, it's insane.
Yeah. And I mean, depending on how you look at science or look at life, I mean, the only reason that we've kind of neglected these things is probably because we've never been able to see these forms of life. We're probably biased in appreciating life and the life that we can see. And just because these things are microscopic doesn't mean that they're not important forms of life and do really important things. And yeah, maybe as we'll discuss more, these really are important forms of life that are kind of fundamental to our own biology.
Maybe before we go into their importance, could you just describe us like what is the microbiome? Because a lot of people know we have E. coli, but the microbiome is more than E. coli. What is the microbiome?
Yeah, so the microbiome is just a term to define all of the microorganisms that live within a particular environment. So, there's a microbiome of the ocean, there's a microbiome of soil, but we humans have our own microbiomes, and so that is the term just to characterize all these bugs that live and interact with each other. So this can include bacteria, viruses, and more complex microorganisms like tiny little worms and kind of more kind of other eukaryotic organisms as well. And so the largest proportion of these bugs in the human body live within the intestine, and particularly in the large intestine, mainly because this is a place that's anaerobic. There's not much oxygen in there, and lots of microbes prefer or can only survive in places where there's no oxygen. There's, of course, a continuous source of food, if we think of all the things that we are eating and drinking on a daily basis. And for various other reasons, they like to live in there, partly due to our own health. And there's a kind of synergistic relationship going on there in our gut where we provide source of food to these bugs and they provide things to us as well. So that's what a microbiome is. So we mainly in research focused on the gut. The gut microbiome is probably the term that people hear most, but there's a microbiome of the skin, there's a microbiome of the lungs, there's a microbiome in various different body parts as well.
But why do we need a gut microbiome?
So, I mean, I could speak to you for an hour about all the different functions, and this is what I suppose my research is looking at, and what plenty of other people's research is looking at, what these microbes do at different stages of life, what they do in different states of health. And so, I mean, some of the most kind of well-known functions, one of the most well-known functions is probably breaking down fiber. So we eat, if you have a relatively healthy diet, a huge amount of fiber every day, probably in the average, at least in the UK diet, 10, 11 grams of fiber a day. We should be getting more. We should be getting 30 grams a day, probably. But this fiber, we as humans aren't genetically encoded to break it down. If we didn't have a gut microbiome, it would just pass right through us. So bugs or the microbiome have the enzymes to break down fiber, which is present in pretty much all fruit and vegetables and grains and nuts and seeds and beans. And so they break down this fiber and create secondary compounds or chemicals, which then humans can absorb and metabolize, and which are really important for our health in a number of ways. They've been shown to be to kind of prevent the growth of cancer cells. They can help the kind of strength of the gut barrier to make sure you have a kind of a healthy gut. To make sure you don't get things like IBS or, as I mentioned, colon cancer, things like that. So that's just one of the things that the gut microbiome do. And we're learning more and more how it can have a kind of direct effect on our health through, let's say, signaling with immune cells in our gut. So if you think about our intestines are the first kind of point of entry for many things into our body. Of course, the skin is a big barrier, but not a lot gets past the skin. But the gut, because of all the things that we ingest on a daily basis, is really that point of defense in which the body decides whether a thing is getting inside our kind of bloodstream and into our tissues or whether it's been excreted. And so the gut microbiome is really a layer of defense there. It sits on top of this barrier, and it plays a part in this decision making about what gets through. And it does this either directly by preventing other, let's say, disease-causing bacteria from getting in, or it can signal and send messages to our immune cells and teach them to learn what is an invader and what should be excreted or what should be allowed in. So they're kind of two things about digesting food and educating the immune system are probably two kind of fundamental things that our gut microbiomes do for our health.
If I would retell that in short, it's like the microbiome is decomposing the fiber and creating secondary metabolites. And those are important for a range of stuff, for our brain as well. And they also are a defense line for bad bacteria and viruses and stuff like that.
Exactly. And I suppose it's not just a defense line, particularly in early life. Even when there isn't let's say, an attack coming from a pathogenic bug or an infection, these good microbes or these non-disease causing microbes play a role in the education of our immune systems. They send messages and continuously communicate and interact with the immune cells that are in our gut and which travel to different parts of the body, and kind of teach them lessons in immunity and keeping ourselves healthy against diseases.
If we would have a bad microbiome, we would become sick more often.
Yeah, exactly. And it's been associated with many different diseases. So of course, you can assume then that if this plays a role in preventing the infections from getting in, if you have a bad microbiome, then you're more likely to get an infection getting into your body, because it has a few different ways that this could happen. First of all, a kind of healthy and diverse microbiome literally takes up physical space along this intestinal barrier. And so it's very hard for an infection then to find a niche or find a gap to set up shop and set up home and begin to grow. So that's why we want lots of different types of microbes in the microbiome. We want a nice, healthy, diverse, and lots of bugs in there to prevent the bad ones from finding a home and growing. But also, as I've mentioned, it can teach the immune system to get rid of these infections. So that's just one thing, but also there's more and more being learned about more kind of non-communicable type diseases. So, as I kind of alluded to, things like colorectal cancer. We know there are certain microbes within the intestine which can cause a human cell to gain a mutation and to turn into cancer. We also know the gut microbiome might actually play a role in how we metabolize and store energy, how we break down and store kind of sugars and fats, which means it may play a role in weight gain or at least in kind of our blood sugar responses, things that are important for diabetes. And as you've alluded to, then there's some really exciting research as well showing that there are kind of physical and biochemical connections between the gut and the brain. There are millions of nerves which physically connect the gut to the brain. And there are also kind of biochemical routes or highways through which different chemicals are sent through the blood and through other kind of routes that are controlled by the bugs that are in our gut.
Yeah, I definitely want to delve a bit deeper into that maybe later on. But for now, we have the gut microbiome, but where does it come from?
So there's a big debate in the field about whether babies or fetuses are exposed to microbes. And I think it's essentially been settled now through a lot of important science, showing that in healthy pregnancies, there isn't a microbiome per se that interacts with the fetus or that colonizes an unborn child. A fetus, we'll use the scientific term. So sometimes when a mother has a urogenital infection, or in certain cases, there might be individual microbes or organisms that make their way to interact with the fetus. But in general, there's no microbiome. There's no like community of organisms there. So as soon as we're born, that's essentially where we get our first inoculum or first coating of bugs. When a baby comes out, suddenly it gets its microbes predominantly from its mum, but also from the environment. So lots of recent kind of interesting evidence shows that babies who are born by C-section versus those who are born by a standard delivery have different microbiomes in the first few weeks and months of life. Because if you think about it, baby born by a standard delivery gets all these bugs from the mother's birth canal, from the mother's gut, it's all this kind of very messy situation where we get lots of microbes. Whereas babies born by C-section, the aim is to make it a very sterile process where mothers are given antibiotics beforehand to reduce the risk of infection. The kind of whole site of the stomach and everything is kind of sterilized and sanitized. And so babies who are born by C-section tend to acquire the microbes that are on the mother's skin and the kind of hospital environment. And so over the course of time, then, there are lots of different other places that these microbes come from. They're kind of mainly from the mother's gut. There seems to be most of the transmission. There's also some from breast milk. There seems to be lots of microorganisms that come there and that colonize or seed the baby's gut. And that's the biggest source of microbes in the first few months of life, depending on how a child is fed. And then if you think about it, babies then tend to start crawling around a bit more. They start interacting with other people and start kind of interacting with their environment a bit more. And so that's where they begin to acquire more microbes from other places. They start eating solid foods. And this is the point at which the microbiome tends to bloom. If you can imagine a it kind of going from a grass field, which is maybe only a few different types of species there, and suddenly it's like a flourishing garden with tons of different types of organisms in there, and you've got beetles and worms, and you've got different colored flowers and trees and everything. That's kind of what happens because there suddenly is these kind of microbial seeds coming in from everywhere. And so that's where we acquire it. And then after that, as we kind of move on from childhood into adulthood, we acquire microbes from people we live with, for example, from our pets, from the environment, from foods that we eat, if we eat kind of yogurts and fermented foods, so that there's lots of different exposures. So that's kind of the life course of how our microbiome assembles.
For a child, does that mean that if the mother has, let's say, an unhealthy microbiome, that it's a problem for the child?
Yes and no. I suppose we don't know enough. There's only a certain number and type of microbes that could survive the baby's gut anyway. So lots of the microbes that are in a mother's gut don't colonize the baby's gut because babies have a very limited food source. They're either getting breast milk or they're getting formula milk. So really the bugs that are in there are those that can survive just on the nutrients that we get from those food sources, or that can survive kind of in very limited environments in the baby's gut. The baby's gut starts off aerobic, there's oxygen in it, and then it slowly turns anaerobic. So yes, there's probably not enough research showing that, whether kind of a mother's microbiome, if it's dysbiotic, as they call it, or bad, if that turns into a dysbiotic one in a baby. Generally speaking, if babies are exclusively breastfed and they're not given other sources of food, that is pretty protective and pretty good for lots of different things. Even babies who are born by a C-section, if they're exclusively breastfed, their gut microbiome tends to normalize, per se, to look more like babies who were born by a normal delivery. So yes and no, but there's probably more research needed to be done on that.
You recommend probably to breastfeed babies.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the WHO recommendations are 100% what I'd agree to, and they are that babies should be exclusively breastfed up until 6 months of age, or around 6 months of age, until babies start showing signs of being able to sit upright and grasp food with their own hands. So around 5 or 6 months. And then the real recommendations actually are to have continued breastfeeding complementary foods up until 1 or 2 years of age. In our kind of Western societies, that's oftentimes not practical. Mothers go back to work and things like that. So the real importance is in the kind of exclusive breastfeeding during that period. But there's good evidence that continued breastfeeding is a good thing as well, at the same time as introducing solid foods. And a lot of that is down to the kind of effects it has on the microbiome.
This whole story also brings me to one of your papers. I'm just gonna pull it up. So the title is The Human Microbiome and Child Growth, First 1000 Days and Beyond. Could you tell me what are like the most important takeaways from that paper?
Yeah, so I mean, that's just a kind of a review that kind of describes all these processes that I've been talking about. But the 1000-day period is a really fundamental framework to view child development. And these 1000 days take the period from conception to 2 years of age, and that's roughly about 1000 days. So as I've mentioned, there isn't a fetal microbiome in utero, but there's interesting evidence from mice studies, at least, and somewhat from observational human studies, that the mother's gut microbiome may impact fetal growth. It may impact kind of prenatal kind of immune development, or kind of even the development of different organs. So I guess what we discuss in that paper is how the effects of the microbiome during this period on some of these critical developmental processes that define child development and child growth. A lot of my research is looking at children who are undernourished or have malnutrition, and the big dogma is that it's all down to a lack of food, which really isn't the case. There are many different processes that go on. But previously, we think about things like immune development, we think about cognitive development, we think about trajectories of growth. And many of these things are defined within this 1,000-day period. So getting nutrition right and getting all these environmental factors and exposures right during this period can set the trajectory for health into later life. And if there are poor exposures during this period, you're more likely to get diseases later on as an adult or later in childhood. And this rings true for the microbiome as well, because the gut microbiome really assembles during this period, as I've mentioned. Imagine this kind of garden kind of growing and blooming. And then once a baby reaches 2 or 3 years of age, it tends to stabilize, and it looks very much like that of an adult. And from then on, your microbiome is stable. Of course, then if you get sick, or if, maybe when you get into your later life, it tends to kind of change a little bit. But overall, it's relatively stable. So the idea is that if this assembly period or this growth period during the first 1,000 days you don't get that right, then that can have longer term effects, and it almost kind of imprints some of these either healthy or poor pathways that can make you more or less likely to become sick for a variety of different disease states.
Imagine you're having a child today, or at least your wife is. What would you have done the previous 9 months, and what will you do the next 2 years to have like the optimum gut microbiome for your child?
Yeah, so as this is a relatively new field, the advice for maintaining a healthy microbiome is still relatively generic. There aren't personalized nutritional recommendations yet for your gut microbiome. So, but we do know lots of things that are important, and so this wouldn't be specific just for pregnancy. This would be specific for maintaining a healthy microbiome at any stage of life, really. And the first one is probably a diversity of plant-based foods in your diet. As I've mentioned before, having a greater diversity or different types of bacteria and microorganisms in your gut has been shown time and time again to be protective against, or at least associated with, reduced risk of a number of different diseases. Because if you think about it, the way I describe it is, if you have any sports team, you want people with many different skills. You don't want on your football team to have 11 defenders or 11 attackers, because then it wouldn't be very good. You want to have good midfielders, defenders, attackers, and that gives you a diverse team with lots of different skills and doing lots of different things. And it's the same for a gut microbiome as well. You want lots of organisms that can do lots of different things for your health. And so the way to get that is to provide this or a bunch of organisms with lots of different types of foods. So you're not giving it the same thing over and over, and you're not having the same breakfast, lunch, and dinner every day. You need to give it as many different types of plants and vegetables and fruits and nuts and seeds and beans as possible, because these contain the substrates for these bacteria to metabolize or break down. So there's been rough estimations of how many different types of plant-based foods should you get into your diet, and one suggestion or study showed that those who ate more than 30 different types of plant-based foods or plants in a week tended to have a healthier microbiome. And it sounds like a huge amount, but if you add up all the different vegetables or fruits you eat in a week, as well as different nuts or seeds or spices, and add in olive oil and all these different things, you can probably reach that target. So that's kind of one way. Another way is to eat kind of fermented foods or foods that contain good microbes themselves. So plain yogurt contains some healthy bacteria in it. And then there's all other kind of niche fermented foods such as kimchi and kefir and kombucha and lots of things like that, which are produced through the action of microbes, and they contain healthy live microbes in them. And they've been shown to change the gut microbiome in a beneficial way as well. And then avoiding other things that can harm your microbiome. So one of the major issues in overall healthcare and in medicine is the over prescription of antibiotics these days. Antibiotics, of course, are really, really important if you have a bad infection. The issue is that they're too often prescribed when people have a very mild infection or an infection that won't be impacted by antibiotics, such as a cold or flu, because these are viruses, and so antibiotics don't work on viruses. And so people might have a cough and a cold and really want to get it better, and they'll go to the doctor and they'll get some antibiotics. And what this does is, first of all, we don't need to go into it now, but it'll cause antimicrobial resistance, which we're probably all going to die of in a few decades' time. But also, these antibiotics destroy your good microbes as well. They not only will target the infection, they'll also kill lots of other good microbes there. So being very careful with antibiotics is an important thing. And of course, use them when they're necessary, but don't use them when they're not. So there are a few different ways that you can enhance your microbiome or at least maintain it.
Maybe also to go back a bit to what you mentioned about fermented foods. What fermented foods do you personally consume or recommend?
So I eat plain yogurt every day. I love it with my breakfast, or even kind of as a dessert with some fruit. So I don't take yogurts which like have flavorings or sugar in. I usually just take plain Greek yogurt or plain normal yogurt, which should just have two ingredients in theory, just milk and bacteria. And then I'd add in some fruit and nuts and seeds. Every so often I might buy some kefir, or I played around a couple of times trying to produce like some kimchi, like fermenting some cabbage and making my own sourdough bread and things like that. But yogurt is the main one for me.
When you consume fermented food, is it actually the microorganisms that pass and go to your intestine? Because, I mean, for example, your stomach is quite acid.
Mm-hmm.
Can they survive that? Or is it like the metabolites that they produce that you are consuming?
Yeah, it's a bit of both. Depending on what microbes are in there, some of them can still survive. So a few of them can survive and then get down into the gut, especially if you're eating them commonly. Not all of them are going to survive, but some of them will. But also, as you mentioned, these microbes have kind of effects within the food themselves. They can produce some of these metabolites or these chemicals, which have their own kind of beneficial effects. So there's a combination, but the evidence does show actually that people who eat lots of fermented foods actually do seem to have a different microbiome, and some of these do seem to set up shop or to colonize their gut. So it seems to be the case that at least some of them do survive.
And do they then also die again when you don't consume them anymore? Or are they self-sustaining?
Yeah, well, it depends on the organism. So generally speaking, probiotics in a pill don't generally colonize. That's not to say they're not beneficial, depending on why you're taking them. They usually can exert their effect, and then if you don't keep taking them, they tend to disappear again. So it really depends. You know, we've to think again here that we're thinking about hundreds, if not thousands, of different organisms. And so we can't classify them all in one way. We can't overall say no bacteria will colonize from fermented foods. Some of them do, some of them don't. And we're still researching which ones do and which ones don't. But generally speaking, your gut microbiome responds relatively quickly to your environment. So if you ate fermented foods for 30 days and then went back to your usual diet of McDonald's and poor thing for the next 30, 60 days, then generally your microbiome will revert back to what it was in the first place.
You mentioned the probiotic pills. Should we use those? Should we take probiotic pills, or is there a point in your life that you should and a point that you shouldn't? What's your take on that?
Yeah, so whenever anyone asks me, should I take probiotics, then my first response is always, well, why are you taking them? You know, what's your reasoning? We've to think about a couple of different things. If you're young and healthy and you don't have any condition, then there's no need to be taking probiotics or any other kind of supplement like that anyway, you know, because there's no real enhancement. You're not going to suddenly turn into Iron Man. So the definition of probiotics are that they are a live microorganism, if administered or provided in sufficient quantities, have a specific health benefit. They have to have a defined health benefit that has been shown in clinical studies. And so there's very few bacteria around the world that have passed this strict criteria. In fact, in the EU, no bacteria, no probiotic has actually fallen past these criteria. So actually in the EU, you'll never see this written on any yogurt drinks or anything in supermarkets anymore, because none of them have achieved that health claim yet. But there are a few pills which have good clinical evidence behind them. And as kind of medications, if you want to put it that way, or as things that you would take under certain criteria, they can be very helpful. But they're not all the same. Again, if you picture that microbes, there are trillions of different types. There's many different types of humans, of all different ethnicities and everything, and we're only one species. And there are thousands, of different species of microbes that can live in the human gut, all doing different things. And the problem is that all of these have been termed as probiotics, whereas they can all do very different things. Some of them can be very effective or not. So there are a handful of probiotics which have really good medical and clinical evidence that they reduce symptoms of irritable bowel syndrome, IBS, for example, and they can reduce bloating and reduce gas and diarrhea and things like that. And you can buy these in pharmacies and in health shops. There are other exciting ones that maybe can even reduce cholesterol, and then a couple here and there who have good evidence, but maybe not as strong that they can even reduce daily anxiety and stress. And so there's lots of research kind of ongoing about this, but there's probably only a very small number of probiotics that really have a clinical benefit. So on a day-to-day basis, unless you have IBS, which a lot of people do, unless you have one of these issues that you're trying to combat, there's no need to take them. And if you do need to take a probiotic, it needs to be the right one with good evidence for not just a general thing that you just find in your corner shop and it says probiotic on it, or it says healthy bacteria.
Because I've heard people also taking probiotics to improve like the brain-gut connection because they believe it will help my brain. Is there any truth to that?
Again, it depends on the bug. I've seen a couple of studies for maybe 2 or 3 probiotics or bacteria in a pill that the self-reported stress or anxiety is down a little bit during the day after taking these for 8 weeks or something like that. It's a very mild effect. And probably if you'd got people to do an exercise regime 2 or 3 times a week, the effect would have been much bigger, than taking one of these things. But sometimes people want to take a pill than do
Don't
other
like
things.
to exercise.
Yeah, exactly. So there are a couple that have that. And now we don't know why that is yet. We don't know how they're working. And that is important because maybe it's that actually, in fact, these bugs they're taking are reducing some of their bloating or their gut symptoms that a lot of people do. And that by extension is making them feel a little bit stressed or anxious during the day. And so there's again, you'd have to choose the right one and look at the science to know. And I'm not branded by any probiotics. I'm not going to start naming out probiotics here at the moment, but there are a few that show that. I'm not entirely convinced that they are the best option if you're really trying to treat daily anxiety and stress. But maybe because there is a lot of ongoing science, there will be a more powerful version of this that can do these things.
The gut microbiome also produces a lot of important metabolites like serotonin and stuff. So is there a way to improve that?
Yeah, again, it's still kind of ongoing research, and there are bugs that can produce serotonin or at least induce our gut cells to produce serotonin. In general, serotonin in itself, made in the gut, doesn't pass into the brain, so it's not quite the same molecule that makes us feel kind of relaxed and happy. Serotonin has lots of different effects in the gut. It generally helps our gut motility. It helps the gut kind of pass food through and things like that. But yeah, from a scientific perspective, there's amazing things that our gut microbiome to do. It can produce all these chemicals like neurotransmitters and different metabolites, which probably do signal to the brain. And lots of interesting studies in mice, at least, have shown this. But again, we haven't shown enough. There isn't enough evidence in humans yet to come up with that amazing thing that will have such a powerful effect on our brain that it will, reduce severe depression or reduce Parkinson's or all these kind of things. But the potential is there. And hopefully there will be some future treatments which would probably always be used as adjunctive therapies. They'd probably be given in combination with medicines, which can enhance the effects on whatever brain issue you're trying to treat.
But it is remarkable that the things that are good for your gut, like exercise and good nutrition, are also important for your brain. So is the brain having an impact on the gut, or is the gut having an impact on your brain, or both?
Yeah, it's both. I mean, the messages are sent in both ways, and there's evidence to show that from all the different electrical signals that are sent through the nervous system, the peripheral nervous systems. There's all like millions or billions of neurons in our brain, trillions, and then there's kind of millions of connections that are physically connected to the gut. And so there's electrical signals which are sent in both directions, meaning that the brain can tell what the gut to do and the gut can tell what the brain to do. And it's not only these electrical signals, there's also kind of hormones that can pass. There's these neurotransmitters, there's kind of more chemical signals which can be sent between the two organs as well. And so absolutely there's great evidence in mice that if you give antibiotics which only affect the bacteria in the gut, they're not absorbed, for example, these can affect the kind of behavior and brain health of mice. And similarly, if you kind of knock out bits of the brain or do something to some nerves in the brain, this can affect gut functioning. So there's definitely two-way communication there, which is really, really important. And so we need to think about, health a little bit more holistically, and we're never just targeting one organ. There's communication going on between everything.
We're both scientists, and a lot of listeners are scientists. We use our brain power, that's our bread and butter. How can we optimize our brain power by the microbiome?
Yeah, again, it's probably too soon to say that, because we don't know, by giving all this kind of food advice for our microbiome, which is generally the best advice we have for our microbiome, we don't know how much of it is placebo effect or how much of it is real kind of biological effect of changing our bugs to optimize our brain. So the only answer I can give you is that kind of generic dietary advice that I've given already about eating a diversity of foods, incorporating some fermented foods into your diet. And yeah, those kind of things are the best ways to enhance our microbiome. And maybe they'll have effects on brain health as well. I mean, there was one clinical study showing this nutritional intervention, which kind of had a Mediterranean diet with lots of these nuts and seeds and plants and olive oil, actually reduce clinical depression. Whether that was through the microbiome or whether it was direct effect to these nutrients or the fact that people just had a nicer diet every day than maybe what they had, we don't really know. But probably there is a small effect of kind of microbiome brain signaling. But it's hard to tell that in humans.
Your gut feeling, so pun intended. How do you think the microbiome can affect, for example, people with depression? Can it alleviate depression, and maybe not completely, but in a lesser degree?
I think only partially. I think depression is a very complex disorder which can be partly genetic, is a lot of kind of our social environment. And so they are always going to be much, much bigger factors than our gut microbiome. I'd say our microbiome has a very small role to play, although it probably does have a role to play. And sometimes, maybe in some people, it has a bigger role to play than others. So any future treatment to try and address depression through the gut is probably only going to be adjunctive. As I said, it's only going to be one part of the puzzle. Having said all that, there is one or two studies looking at particular probiotics which can reduce kind of some features of depression, kind of self-reported scores of your kind of mental health, when taking a particular probiotic, let's say for a couple of months. There's interesting trials of people doing fecal microbiota transplants, which we might talk more about, but literally transplanting the microbiome from a healthy person into a depressed person. People are studying this. I don't think there's very good evidence yet that it actually works, but this may improve brain health in some people. But I think in general, depression is a bit of a difficult one because it's so complex and has so many different different factors, and it's always going to be more complex than, let's say, an intestinal issue or something, like a bit more biological. It doesn't have as much of a kind of psychosocial element to it.
Yeah, like you said, like depression is such a broad term. You have so many different, like, call it types of depression. So I totally get your point, but I am interested actually in the microbiome transplants. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so they are kind of really what they are. You're literally taking the intestinal contents or a fecal sample from a healthy person, cleaning out your diseased person, no matter what disease they have, through laxatives and things like that, and then giving them an infusion of feces, into their gut to really change their microbiome as much as possible. So it's kind of a really drastic treatment. Rather than just through a probiotic adding in one or two different types of bacteria, you're trying to really transplant the microbiome from one person to another. So there's different ways you can do. You can either do this through a nasogastric tube, through a rectal tube, and get infusions, or you can eat about 40 frozen pills, which is probably the worst option out of them all. At the moment, this is only authorized for use in clinical settings for a specific infection, Clostridium difficile infection, and it's only for recurrent Clostridium difficile infection. And this is a really bad infection that people pick up in hospital. And when it's bad, it's really bad. You can have bloody diarrhea. People can die of it if they're old. You can have just awful stomach cramps for months on end. And this is the best known treatment for it. And it's much more effective than antibiotic treatment. It's 80, 90% effective. And so now this has been studied for lots of different conditions, things like IBD, inflammatory bowel disease, or even some more kind of controversial trials looking at things like autism and kind of brain disorders, but also things like metabolic syndrome. So it's an exciting tool. There's some interesting evidence to show that it might actually, again, be an adjunctive therapy when given in combination with treatment for skin cancer. It might actually be quite beneficial, because this complete rapid change in your microbiome can change how your immune system responds as well. So it might have a role to play in certain cancers. So fecal microbiome transplants are a really exciting field of research. But there's lots of companies now trying to do this in a cleaner way, for a variety of different reasons. One, because not a lot of people want to get a fecal microbiota transplant. Second, for kind of safety reasons. In general, it's very safe, but there have been one or two cases of very poor, bad things happening where someone got a fecal microbiome transplant and it turns out they got a antimicrobial resistant infection as part of it, and they ended up dying. Usually the screening process for fecal transplants are even more strict than a blood transplant, but these things can happen. So some companies now are trying to create what they call defined consortia, to try and find what the bacteria and the elements are within the fecal transplants and pick out those important ones and put these into a pill, so that you're not taking a whole fecal sample, and trying to use these to treat some of these conditions that I've spoken about.
Well, if it can help cure or prevent like a really serious disease, I think it's worth to try, right?
Of course. Yeah. And I mean, people who have recurrent C. diff infections and are really struggling, it's life-saving. It completely can turn them around, and so they'll do anything, and it really kind of improves their lives.
But a lot of the experiments have been done actually on mice, not on people. So in general, in the past, what has been proven to work on mice? Does it also work on people, or is it really diverse?
Again, it depends what condition you're talking about. So for these fecal transplants in the C. diff infections, that's been done in humans and shown over and over that it's very, very effective. So that at least we can rely on. A handful of these probiotic studies that I spoke about have large, good clinical trials. So for example, some that reduce symptoms of IBS, reduce bloating and gas. Some of those have been done in humans. And then some smaller studies in humans, as I've alluded to, showing kind of fecal microbiome transplants in kind of immunotherapy for certain cancers. They've been shown in humans. A lot of the more exploratory stuff in brain connections, things like Parkinson's disease and depression and other types of cancers and IBD, a huge amount of it has been done in mice. So it's kind of like any field of science, really. You have to do these experiments in mice first, and mice are a very important model to try and figure out, do these things work? You can't just straight away try these things in humans. But we have to be careful that we don't rely on mice data and say that this will work for humans, and we don't get ahead of the curve. The microbiome is a very exciting field, but there's probably too much hype at the moment and too much excitement, which hasn't been proven through human studies. And that shows at the moment the only real revelation clinical treatments to come out of all of microbiome science are fecal microbiome transplants for C. diff infection. And they're a fairly crude treatment. And these handful of probiotics, and then after that, dietary treatments are fairly generic. And a lot of people are trying to create personalized microbiome diets at the moment, which there isn't enough evidence to show that they work at the moment. And so that is a work in progress, but an exciting potential that we can create diets for ourselves based on our own unique microbiomes.
Imagine you find a treatment for Parkinson's based on the microbiome in mice, and it works 100% of the time. Do you have any idea how big the chances that it would also work on humans? Is it like 50-50?
I mean, it totally depends. It's this doesn't apply solely to microbiome research. This applies to all drug research, in that you can have the best results all in mice and shows work, and then suddenly the trial fails in humans. So it really depends. You know, the microbiome of mice, somewhat similar to humans, but is not exactly the same. And usually when you're working with mice, the microbiomes are all a bit more uniform. They're a bit more same between all the animals, where us humans are so different in all our microbiomes. So there'll be much more variable responses to a treatment. So you can never know until you do that clinical study, and you have to do lots of phases of clinical trials. And yeah, I mean, there's interesting research showing that maybe we should be humanizing mice a bit more before we do clinical trials, like putting human microbiomes and human immune systems into mice before you try out a drug or whatever the treatment is, because mice aren't humans. And
Oh, really?
and because so many drugs fail after promising mice data,
Yeah.
and this doesn't translate into human data. But again, that's not just the microbiome field, that's kind of
No, true.
medical field in general.
Yeah, but that's actually why I asked, because I know mice are used very often in medical treatments or in tests. So I assume the data you get from mice have to say something. Otherwise, why do it?
Oh, of course. Yeah. I mean, there's tons of mouse data that doesn't work. A lot of the time it's not published, unfortunately. And it's only really the promising mouse stuff that then kind of usually turns into clinical trials. I mean, sometimes people, especially in nutrition trials and probiotic trials, sometimes even skip the mouse stuff and go straight into humans, because there's not much risk. You know, this isn't like a dangerous pharmaceutical drug you're giving people. And generally probiotics are seen as foods. And so maybe there is some strength in the point that we could do some work straight into humans rather than wasting animals and certainly for nutrition studies. But a lot of the time you need to get that evidence first in animals to show that it might work in humans.
If you're just guessing, do you think it also happens the other way around, that something doesn't work in mice, but it would have worked in people or in humans?
Yeah, I think so. There's a great study showing that again, it's to do with this humanization of mice, and mice having different immune systems and different microbiomes. And it's possible that certain drugs or certain treatments only work when they're exposed to certain types of microbes. So I don't know, there's an example that there's one drug that's given to humans, it's for heart health, that is kind of detoxified or is broken down by a specific bug within the gut microbiome. And so it might work in some people and mightn't work in others if they have this bug or not. And maybe that bug doesn't really generally colonize mice. And so you wouldn't actually know without doing that in humans. So absolutely that could be the case. And depending on your context, you might have to do mouse work, or you might have to do more work in humans. And that's why the microbiome field is so interesting, is because we all have unique microbiomes. And so maybe a drug for me that might work and it wouldn't work for you because I have a certain microbiome. And so this is where we get into the field of personalized medicine and personalized nutrition, which previously, before we knew much about the microbiome, tended to be based on genetics. And if you have a certain gene and I don't, then maybe a certain diet or medication work for me and it wouldn't work for you. But we can't change our genetics and we can change our microbiome. So there's more potential to create personalized medicine or personalized nutrition based on our microbiomes than our genetics.
And when we're talking about personalized foods and diets, one of the things that is very hot topic right now is ultra processed food. How does that affect your microbiome?
So I have varying opinions on ultra processed foods. I think it's a marketing term and it really means nothing, to be honest. Ultra processed foods just mean foods high in fat and sugar and bad things. And we know, I mean, it's not a new thing, ultra processed foods. It just means bad foods, really. And we know all about them already. And there's not good evidence to show that the processing per se is the bad thing versus the fat and the sugar and everything that's in it already. So ultra processed foods in general annoys me a little bit. However, there is some data emerging to show that some additives might have a bad effect on the microbiome. So emulsifiers and sweeteners and artificial sweeteners may actually have negative effects on the gut. So these emulsifiers, which help oil and water mix and are added into lots of foods like ice cream and ketchup and loads of things we eat now, they can actually have a negative effect on the gut lining and the gut microbiota or gut microbiome. And some sweeteners, artificial sweeteners, maybe have a negative effect on the gut microbiome as well, which can have a detrimental effect on our blood sugar responses. So these kinds of things, yeah, it's possible, have a poor effect. But I think we need to rethink the term ultra processed foods because really it kind of refers to it can refer to lots and lots of different food types which aren't necessarily unhealthy. And we need to maybe focus a little bit more on these specifics of what actually is causing the problem. Is it the fat and the sugar? Is it some of these additives? And we need to look at nutrition a little bit more holistically.
No, I totally get that. But when you talk about like artificial sweeteners, does that mean that actually, like, for example, a diet soda with an artificial sweetener could be worse for you than a normal soda? Or is it just, yeah, I know they're both probably not that great for you, but I mean.
So again, it depends on what you mean by worse for you. We have to think about dose, how much of this you're drinking. So there's good evidence that in people who drink a lot of normal sodas and have a high sugar intake, if they replace these with diet soda, they'll lose weight. And this is a good thing for them. So in that context, they're a good thing. If you're introducing diet sodas into your diet and you didn't have them before, or you're suddenly having lots and lots of artificial sweeteners, there may be a bad thing. There's not enough evidence to show that they are. I mean, there's very, very small and weak evidence that maybe they're slightly more carcinogenic than kind of other things in our diet. So it's all about nuance and how much of these things you drink. There's absolutely no problem with drinking a diet soda or a normal soda once a week, a couple of times a week, and it's all about dose. So, but from the microbiome perspective, we're not too sure yet whether a huge amount of sugar is better or worse than a huge amount of artificial sweeteners. It seems that maybe the artificial sweeteners aren't great, but we need more evidence on that.
And aside from the term ultra processed food, do you consume them? And I know you should temper your consumption of ultra processed food, but what is like your favorite ultra processed food, your guilty pleasure or something?
Oh yeah, I'd have like a chocolate bar, a few times a week, maybe. I've no problem with that because I know that overall nutrition is about balance over a long period of time, and so my whole life, or at least my whole adult life, I've been very interested in nutrition and food. And generally speaking, over the course of 20 years, I have a very good diet in that I eat lots of fruit and vegetables and whole grains. I do a lot of cooking. But absolutely, I have ice cream and I have chocolate. I mean, ice cream and chocolate bars, are probably my ultra processed food of choice. Now, I don't eat a tub a day. I probably have them, every second day, a little bit here and there. And I get lots of fruit and vegetables and lots of grains and all these other things. And I'm very active as well. So I know I'm very healthy. So I think there's probably too much demonization of foods. The problem is when you get the balance wrong. If you have a good diet generally and you can have these treats semi regularly, there's nothing wrong with that.
So before we close, do you have a take-home message for our listeners?
Yeah, I think my take home message is that when we're eating, you're not just feeding yourself. We're kind of feeding this mass of life inside of us, and there's thousands, if not millions, of other organisms living inside of us, and so we have to consider that we're feeding those as well. So don't just rely on the same foods that you eat all the time. If you're going doing your grocery shopping and just buying the same things over and over, or eating the same thing for your lunch or your breakfast, you need to consider that you're feeding lots of other uh, life forms which have lots of different preferences for food. So try and bring in lots of different types of plants, and whether that's beans or nuts or seeds or vegetables or fruits. And that can have a really beneficial effect on not only your gut health, but your overall health as well.
Perfect. A great take-home message.
Great, thanks.
This was Apple Finch Pudding. I want to thank Ruairi Robertson for the information. Let's meet again for the next episode of Apple Finch Pudding.